What's the biggest misconception institutions still have about DeFi lending today?
The reasons that institutions stayed away from DeFi was the lack of control. So with Morpho, we've got this isolated market design and vault structure that solves this directly. Morpho started as a protocol really optimizing lending rates on top of existing DeFi protocols. So what changed was institutions kept saying to us they wanted more efficiency and transparency, specifically of on-chain markets, but they wanted to set their own rules. We built institutions essentially what they were asking for. It was programmable, isolated, auditable lending infrastructure that they could deploy on their own terms.
What problem does Morpho solve better than earlier lending protocols?
You can think about us as the Swift or HTTP of finance. We give institutions a production-ready lending backend that's battle-tested against billions.
In case we have this conversation again, for example, in 2030, what do you think will have changed most dramatically about how institutions use blockchain infrastructure?
Good question.
Thank you very much, Guy, friends of CCN, for joining today's call with Dennis Bree, who is head of institutional at Morpho. Thank you, Dennis, for your time.
It's good to meet you.
So let's start this show. You work closely with both crypto-native firms and traditional institutions. What's the biggest misconception institutions still have about DeFi lending today?
Good question. I think the biggest misconception is that DeFi is one big pool of risk. When talking to institutions, they hear the DeFi lending, they picture a single protocol where everybody's exposed to the same counterparty and the same collateral. But the reality with Morpho is actually the opposite. We're an infrastructure on which everything is isolated, the market's isolated from the vaults, and institutions can define exactly what collateral they accept and on what they lend. So it's closer to a structured credit desk than what most people imagine that they hear in DeFi.
And Morpho has grown recently from a DeFi protocol into institutional financial infrastructure. Was that always your vision, or did institutional demand pull Morpho in that direction?
Yeah, Morpho started as a protocol really optimizing lending rates on top of existing DeFi protocols. So what changed was institutions kept saying to us they wanted more efficiency and transparency, specifically of on-chain markets, but they wanted to set their own rules. So the demand is what shaped the vault architecture. We built institutions essentially what they were asking for. It was programmable, isolated, auditable lending infrastructure that they could deploy on their own terms.
And you often talk about encoding investment rules directly into crypto infrastructure. What does that actually mean in practice for an institution managing billions in assets?
Let's say that you've got a pension fund and it's got a mandate that says only lend against USDC collateral or Bitcoin collateral, or only accept borrowers that meet a certain criteria, or set cap exposures at a certain level. So today, enforcing those rules off-chain requires layers of intermediaries and back office with manual oversight. On Morpho, you can encode those rules directly into a vault, and then the vault would execute that mandate autonomously and transparently. So no one can override those rules once they're set. And that's what the encoding investment rules means. In infrastructure, it enforces the mandate rather than you having a large back office.
Okay, why do institution prefers modular infrastructure like Morpho instead of building proprietary systems entirely in-house? I mean, what problem does Morpho solve better than earlier lending protocols?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually had this conversation with a large US bank. So it's the reason that banks don't build this is the same reason that they don't build their own cloud infrastructure. It's expensive, it's slow, and it's not their core competency. So you can think about us as the Swift or HTTP of finance. We give institutions a production-ready lending backend that's battle-tested against billions. So they plug in, they define their own risk and parameters, and through the vault architecture, they can go live. And this is the difference between us and previous protocols. Earlier protocols would give you one pool, one risk of parameters, no customization. If you wanted to lend, you're exposed to the entire protocol. We separate the infrastructure from the strategy.
Okay. And, Coinbase, Bitwise, Societe Generale, Forge, and also Apollo are very different organizations. What common need or pain point brought all of them toward Morpho?
Yeah. So, Giuseppe, every institution that I talk to is the same core need. Like, they want to participate on chain, they see the benefit, but they don't want to build the infrastructure themselves. So a custodian will come to us for different reasons than an asset manager, but the underlying requirement is mostly the same. So they need neutral infrastructure that doesn't compete with their core business. Morpho is not a bank. They want to be able to customize it so that they can bring their off-chain practices on-chain, and something that provides full transparency for their customers and their compliance teams. So the neutrality is why a lot of organizations at different parts of the ecosystem, whether it be a bank, a custodian, a fintech, or an asset manager, all converge on Morpho.
And at what point did you realize that institutional adoption of on-chain lending was moving from experimentation to something which is more serious?
Yeah, I think it was when the Genius Act passed. I mean, that kind of changed the conversation overnight, right? Banks that have been watching from the sidelines kind of suddenly had this regulatory clarity around a core asset that drives on-chain lending. So stablecoins are the blood of DeFi and lending markets. And once we had a regulatory framework that was in place, institutions effectively had the green light to engage.
And do you think that institutions primarily come to Morpho for yield, operational efficiency, transparency, or programmable risk management?
I think all four, but the entry point depends on who you're talking to. So an asset manager would come for yield and risk. Custodians would come for operational efficiency. And banks would come for transparency, but need compliance is absolutely core to them. So once they're on the platform, they realize that the benefits are inseparable from some of the others, but programmable risk management produces better yield, transparency enables compliance, and efficiency reduces cost.
So how relevant, how important is customizability for institutional adoption?
I think it's the single biggest unlock. The reasons that institutions stayed away from DeFi was the lack of control. Like this pooled exposure with no ability to set your own parameters was just not something that they would entertain. So with Morpho, we've got this isolated market design and vault structure that solves this directly.
Okay, let's move to real-world assets. They've become one of crypto's strongest institutional narratives these days. What do you think tokenized treasuries and private credit are getting traction faster than other categories?
I think they solve a real problem today. I mean, tokenized treasuries give institutions a way to earn yield on idle stablecoin reserves with familiar, understood collateral. Private credit is getting traction, but I think both categories benefit from existing regulatory clarity around the assets. The next step and where we fit in is making those assets productive, because you can have a real world assets that sits in a brokerage account, or you can have a digital version of that that sits in an on-chain wallet. But unless there's some utilization of those assets, they're kind of the same. So holding them and using them as collateral in lending markets rather than just holding them passively is, I think, the real unlock.
Is there any particular topic that you think that the whole DeFi industry can't avoid to ignore, something like, for example, the use of artificial intelligence or anything else?
I mean, I think a pivotal moment would be a major global bank running its production lending book on chain, not as a pilot, but as core infrastructure. So when a top 10 bank says we're doing lending now, and this is the moment that I think that it becomes impossible for the industry to ignore, and we're closer than people think. My role is speaking to the largest banks in the world, and they understand the building blocks are already in place. We've got regulated custodial integration, we've got institutional grade risk management through curators, and we've got an infrastructure that's already managing and supporting billions of dollars.
Okay, just last question before leaving here. In case we have this conversation again, for example, in 2030, in the future, what do you think will have changed most dramatically about how institutions use blockchain infrastructure?
I mean, my hope by 2030 is that there won't be necessarily a distinction between on-chain and off-chain. That institutions won't think about where capital is deployed from an infrastructure perspective. They'll think about risk, return, and the infrastructure becomes invisible. Like the same way today, nobody asks whether they sent a wire transfer over Swift or something else. Nobody should ask whether their lending position is on-chain or off-chain. It just works.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Dennis, for your time and for your insights, and have a good rest of the week.
Thank you, Giuseppe.